Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Ed Wong of the New York Times about his book, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China. And we break down the latest Russian attacks on Ukraine, the intense debate over whether President Trump should order military strikes on Iran, and the threats to national security posed by underground tunnels. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. So much news happening all over the place this week. Fast-moving developments in the Mideast, which we'll get into later in the show. We also have a fascinating conversation with Ed Wong from the New York Times, so stay tuned for that coming up in just a minute. But before we get there, first things first, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be on here with you for another week. Obviously, the Israel-Iran war is dominating our attention right now, and it's a fluid situation since we don't know, as we're taping this on the afternoon of Thursday, June 19, whether President Trump will order the U.S. military to bomb Iran. I do know that you, Ben, told me before we pressed record that you're going to have a kind of a deep dive analysis that you're going to give us later in the podcast. So for now, I will just say that it is sobering to look out at the world now and see two full-on wars raging with consequential ties to great powers, whether it's the U.S.-Israel ties or the China-Iran ties. Remember, China has emerged as a major strategic partner of Iran in recent years and leads the world in purchases of Iranian oil. But I digress on that for now. Of course, the other war is ongoing between Russia and Ukraine. And while global media attention is full on the Middle East right now, we've been tracking the blow-by-blow in Ukraine in the Threat Status Daily newsletter, most notably how Russian military forces have been steadily increasing missile and drone attacks targeting Ukrainian civilians in Kiev, with a particularly intense overnight blitz between June 16 and 17 that demolished a 9-story apartment building in the Ukrainian capital, killing at least 15 people and injuring more than 150. That particular Russian attack featured more than 440 drones and 32 missiles that basically sent explosions echoing through Kiev for about 9 hours and signaled an intensified Russian focus on hitting the Ukrainian capital following the recent failure of 2 rounds of direct peace talks. It certainly feels like this is the way that Russia has decided to retaliate against Ukraine for the vast drone attack that Ukrainian forces carried out on June 1, hitting military bases and aircraft deep inside Russia. That was called Operation Spiderweb. Switching gears, Ben, I've also been tracking how North Korea has just held a relaunch ceremony for the new naval destroyer that capsized during its initial launch attempt last month. This 5,000-ton destroyer will give North Korea the kind of naval reach it has never before possessed, and it could enable Pyongyang to join in high-tech Navy exercises held by China and Russia in the region that challenge the emerging U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral alliance. Finally, Ben, we've been tracking in the Threat Status newsletter for a while how there's this generational convergence going on between Silicon Valley tech companies and the U.S. military and wider national security sector. The U.S. Army has now recruited tech execs from Meta, OpenAI, and Palantir to formally join the service through something called Detachment 201. It's a new executive innovation corps aimed at driving a U.S. military tech overhaul, basically with brain power from California software companies. The Army said in a statement that, quote, Detachment 201 is an effort to recruit senior tech executives to serve part time in the Army Reserve as senior advisors.
Yeah, that's an
End quote.
interesting development. We'll keep an eye on that. You know, guys, as you mentioned, we're all, of course, waiting to see whether President Trump orders U.S. military strikes on Iran and specifically Iran's nuclear program and the underground site at Fordo, which only the U.S. and its bunker buster bombs can reach. Now, the decision may already have been made by the time you all listen to this podcast. So I thought a good way maybe to get into this conversation today is to step back and look at the factors Trump is weighing.
One thing, Ben, before you continue, to give listeners just a look behind the scene, the amount of hand wringing and acrimony that goes on between the two of us when we tape this during really fluid international conflict situations because of the concern that as soon as you say that Trump is going to bomb Fordo or order U.S. forces to bomb it, that somehow that will happen between the few hours that we tape this and it actually goes live on all platforms early Friday morning.
And that's exactly the situation we found ourselves in last week, which listeners, of course, know that we broke down whether Israel was going to attack Iran, and it happened Thursday night, a few hours after we recorded. So that's a similar situation that we find ourselves in today. But now some of this is going to hold true no matter what Trump decides, and that's the factors that are going to lead to his decision one way or the other. As Guy has covered Iran's nuclear program now for more than a decade. I've been covering President Trump's foreign policy philosophy for about that long. So I think I've got a fairly good handle, I think, on what's at play, you know, sort of in his mind right now. And of course, this is playing out in real time publicly for everyone to watch. This debate between some figures in the MAGA community like Steve Bannon or Tucker Carlson saying Trump can't intervene in the Middle East, while more traditional Republican hawks like Senator Lindsey Graham are arguing that we ought to seriously consider it. So
I believe the Washington Times headline, the Washington Times headline on that this week was had the word meltdown in it.
yeah, something like that. Yeah, I would encourage listeners, if you want some entertainment, to go watch the Tucker Carlson Ted Cruz interview from earlier this week as well, where they debated this very question. So why would Trump not want to do this? Why will he decide potentially to not bomb Fordo and take out Iran's nuclear program once and for all? For one, politically, and this is where the MAGA Steve Bannon point of view comes in, it goes against seemingly everything he stood for on his Mideast policy for over a decade. He's built his foreign policy platform criticizing U.S. forever war, specifically intervention in the Middle East, in Iraq in particular. This, it would seem to me, would be a complete reversal of that. But then when you drill down deeper, there's, of course, the direct danger to U.S. troops who would undoubtedly become targets immediately for Iran and its proxies like Hezbollah, the Houthis, Shiite militias, not to mention the risk that U.S. planes could actually be shot down over Iran conducting the operation, which would introduce a whole other set of challenges and complications to this.
Isn't that what the plot of the Top Gun remake movie was about?
It was something similar to that, I believe. Yeah. There's been a number of movies related to U.S. military involvement in Iran. Of course, the hostage crisis, Argo being one of my favorites. Bigger picture, Guy, of course, this could spiral out of control. Would the U.S. eventually decide it needs to undertake outright regime change in Iran? Does that put us in a position where, once again, we're nation building in the Mideast? And does Trump really want to do that? And not to shortchange the fact that this could spark a new wave of Islamic terrorism in much the same way that U.S. involvement in Iraq paved the way for ISIS. So when you consider all that, it would seem kind of cut and dry. It's a bad idea. Let's not do it. But here's why, Guy, I think it is on the table and maybe should be. Trump wants to fundamentally reshape the Middle East, right? He wants to get Saudi Arabia, Syria, other nations to recognize Israel diplomatically. He wants a safer region for Israel, for U.S. troops, and as a zone for economic development. That probably just can't happen, one might argue, with a hostile Iranian regime developing nuclear weapons and operating agents of chaos across the Middle East with its proxy network. So if you were going to do it, if you decided this is a means to an end and the ends justify the means, you'll never have a better time to do it than right now. Iran's vulnerable. Its missile defenses have been devastated by Israel over the past week. You may never get another opportunity like this for years, maybe decades. And last thing, one more thing, Guy, there's no small point here. There's also an element, I think, as far as Trump is concerned, of making sure the word of the United States, its rhetoric, means something. Trump warned Iran repeatedly that it needed to make a deal to curb its nuclear program or face consequences. These would be the consequences. If you're going to dole out consequences in the form of military action, isn't it better to go all the way than just rely on Israel to do it for you when apparently they're not able to do the job entirely by itself? So there's a lot here. In some ways, it's simple, right? Drop the bomb, not drop the bomb. But these are the kinds of decisions that will literally shape U.S. foreign policy and world events potentially for decades to come. And it's not to be taken lightly. And I think that's why we see President Trump weighing this so heavily throughout this week and possibly into the weekend. It seems to me, understands the gravity of the moment right now that's in front of him.
Also likely seems to operate in his most efficient state when the spotlight is on him as the decider. So that may be factoring into how long he's going to drag this out for.
He almost seems to be relishing it in some ways, right? Everybody waiting to see what he's going to decide to do.
On another front, Ben, there are so many uncertainties at play, including whether the Iranian government will collapse and what kind of domestic strife might get unleashed inside Iran if that happens, let alone the regional refugee crisis it could spur. One other thing we've been tracking in the threat status newsletter, Ben, is how the more than 400 missiles that Iran has fired at Israel since June 13 have created an unprecedented test of Israel's coveted high-tech Iron Dome missile defense shield. As of June 19, Israel said more than 40 Iranian missiles had managed to pierce the multi-layered air defense system, hitting targets and claiming lives in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and wounding more than 200 people Thursday at the main hospital in the southern Israeli town of Beersheba. The success or failure of Iron Dome is sure to spur debate going forward over the future of the Trump administration's push for a so-called Golden Dome missile defense shield for the United States. Ed Wong is the author of At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China, an amazing book that won the Beifang Shell Book Prize and was a finalist for the 2025 Orwell Prize. The book is a unique look at China by a Chinese-American journalist. It's a gripping chronicle of a family that spans decades of reality-altering change, a journey from the Mao Zedong era to today. It delivers some deep insights into the current authoritarian era. Ed Wong, thank you for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Guy. And Guy, I have fond memories of our travels with a certain Secretary of State, so it's good to be back.
Well, we'll get into that. For context, you are a top diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, rival news organization, but that's how I know you. Yes, we did travel together with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reporting on his exploits in the first Trump administration. And I was really struck when I met you back then, I think 2019, by how humble you were about your knowledge of China. When I met you, you had, I think, really just returned from nearly a decade as China correspondent and Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. So I want to start by just asking you now, at this critical moment of great power U.S.-China competition, how do you view the Chinese government? Do you believe that it is overstated in the U.S. media right now that China is an authoritarian power that seeks world domination or seeks to unseat or undermine the U.S. and its network of allied democracies? Or is that actually an accurate depiction in 2025?
That's a great question, Guy. It's really the biggest question confronting us about China. So undoubtedly, China is an authoritarian power and has grown more authoritarian under the rule of Xi Jinping. It has become less open to experimentation with Western models of governance and Western economic systems. It has become much more entrenched in one party and specifically one man rule. It has become more repressive at home as it has cracked down on dissenters from Hong Kong to the northwest region of Xinjiang to Beijing itself. In terms of its foreign policy, it does seek to at least match or unseat the U.S. in global influence. I don't know if world domination is exactly the right term for it, because when we think of authoritarian powers and global domination, we think of, say, 1930s Germany or 1930s Japan. But I would say that China is somewhat different, because I think what it has done is it has looked at the U.S. model of dominance around the world. And instead of seeking to, say, conquer territories by military force around the world, it wants to project power in the same way that the U.S. does and essentially usurp the U.S. position in many of the world's institutions. So it looks around at the way the U.S. set up its empire after World War II, through things like the UN or the World Bank or other multilateral institutions. It looks at the way that the U.S. set up its military bases around the world, and projects power via those bases, whether it's in the Red Sea, or in the Indian Ocean or in the Western Pacific. And it essentially wants to do the same thing, in my opinion. It sees this new model of imperial power and is replicating that in different ways. And it also sees, for instance, the way that the US has established the dollar as the reserve currency around the world. And it is hoping that the renminbi becomes adopted as the reserve currency by nations. And that is something that would give the government enormous influence, especially through sanctions power, for instance. And that's one of the tools that the U.S. wields in its imperial power. But I think in terms of its immediate military goals, it does seek dominance in the Asia Pacific region, where right now the U.S. is the dominant military power. And I think this is the hardest point of tension in the U.S.-China relationship, even more than the trade relations, which I think is very important. But I think that in the Asia Pacific region, there can really only be, one dominant military power at any given time, one power that has unfettered access to the seas.
Or control over the sea lines of communication, the S lock, where all of the energy moves, where all of the goods move.
Right, the Strait of Malacca, the military bases in the region. And so the US has played that role since the end of World War II, and China now seeks to play that role. And that's why you've seen its expansionist policies in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, its moves around Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait, though I do think Taiwan is a special issue for the Chinese leadership. We can talk more about that if you want. But essentially, this is where the two powers come into sharpest conflict, and we're seeing that play out every month in encounters that take place out there.
I want to get back to that before we finish, but Ben, why don't you go ahead?
So let me bring this kind of back to your experience writing your book, At the Edge of Empire: A Family's Reckoning with China, because I think it's, that sort of informs the discussions that we're having here. And you tell the story, of course, of your father's journey from Hong Kong across China, eventually to America. I'm always curious when talking to a fellow journalist like yourself, how you sort of decide, to write a book like this, and then, two, how exactly you're going to go about it. Can you kind of take us inside your thought process on those two questions about your book?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Ben. And I think I first settled on writing this book At the Edge of Empire towards the end of my time in China around 2015 or 2016, because I wanted to write a book that encapsulated a lot of the reporting that I'd done in China, including reporting on Xi Jinping's rise and the growing authoritarian nature of China. But I also wanted to do it in a manner that would carry the reader through a human narrative, so that they would be following the events in China, but from a very human perspective and not necessarily from a geopolitical perspective. And I also wanted to somehow put it in the context of Mao era China and what Mao had done to China, because I think that informs everything that's going on today, especially with Xi Jinping's very explicit references to Mao and to the Mao era. So I thought the best way of doing that, the most thrilling way of doing that for a reader, was to tell about my family's story, and specifically about my father, because he was a soldier in Mao's army, and he was posted to some of the farthest flung frontiers of China in order to recreate the Chinese empire. And I feel like that's the prism through which I saw China in the Sea era as well, that here was this power that was rising, that was rivaling the reach of America, and that was essentially a reconstituted empire that the communists had stitched together, and that she was trying to hold on to by immense force and by coercive means. And so I thought that telling the story of my father, his time in the army, his desire to fight the Americans on the Korean Peninsula at first, but then being sent out to the Xinjiang region of the Northwest and being part of the military occupation that eventually leads to a very coercive form of control of the Uyghur Muslims and the Kazakh Muslims out there, and is also taking place in parallel with what's going on in Tibet. I think that's all very important to our understanding of China and to our understanding of why China is the imperial power that it is today, with both its repressive forms of control within its boundaries and also its global ambitions.
And what was most so meaningful for you, sort of personally, in writing this book? I mean, did it change in some ways for the better or for the worse the way you thought about your father and what you knew about him, for example?
Yeah, I started interviewing my father about his past when I was in my 20s, when I was a grad student at Berkeley, but it was kind of on a superficial level. And what it did was that gave me some context for both my travels in China after grad school, plus my reporting in China when I was in the New York Times there. But I really dove into very detailed interviews starting in 2018 after I moved back to Washington and when I started my diplomatic beat. And the guy saw me doing that day job, but on the side, I was interviewing my father about his time. And I think what emerged to me was a fairly complex picture of, patriotism, loyalty, and ideology in China. I think that really gave me a very three-dimensional perspective of how Chinese citizens feel about their country, both in the past and in the current day. And so, like, my father is an example of someone who was swept up in the communist revolution and in these Maoist ideas. And he remained loyal to it for many years, even as the state and the party subverted his own personal ambitions. Like they prevented him from going to fight the Americans in the Korean War because they were suspicious of his background. He came from a Chinese capitalist family in Hong Kong, a merchant family. His brother had gone to study in America and eventually worked for the U.S. military in America. So, of course, the party under Mao had deep suspicions of my father. And even though he tried to prove his loyalty to them over and over in his time in the army, they never accepted him. I think that really speaks to one, the youthful ideal of people like him at the time, and how the party, its propaganda, and its ideology can really sweep people in. And then eventually the way it holds animus against people who have elements that are different and that don't conform to the party's vision and its ideology, especially elements in a family background that might be connected to America or to things abroad. And I think that that speaks a lot to our current day as well, because in my reporting on the Xi era, and that I talk about in the book, there became an increasing obsession with foreign elements trying to subvert China. And this became, and like whether rightly or wrongly, they believed that there were elements outside of China, the America, Western nations that were seeking to undermine the party, to weaken the party, to overthrow the party in some cases. And so this became foundational, I think, to the way that she galvanized nationalism at home.
Ed, Donald Trump certainly doesn't seem to conform to what had been establishment U.S. foreign policy of viewing China and the CCP as being on the verge of some capitalist opening, political reform. I want to shift gears back to contemporary geopolitics for a second. You're right now covering aspects of the Trump administration's foreign policy. You're probably the highest profile or one of Chinese American journalists in the U.S. print media writing in English. How do you view the overall Trump administration policy toward China? Trump has expressed a kind of respect for Xi Jinping, but it's clearly confrontational. There's a kind of rhetorical brinkmanship going on. Do you think that Trump is heading into a foreign policy failure here, or is his posture actually much needed at this moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like the way you framed it and that you pointed out these contradictions in the way that Trump approaches China. I think that that's the most important thing to hold in one's head, because when people talk to me about the Trump administration, China, I feel like a certain number of people have a misconception of the way Trump approaches China. So I don't think Trump is your classic China hawk. I don't think that he adopts the sort of idea of military confrontation, for instance, that some people, even his current administration, have had in the past, or that certainly people in his first administration had, like this idea of confronting China as it builds up its military, as it pushes its naval vessels outward in the Asia Pacific region, or even as it conducts, say, espionage operations all over the world. Like, I don't think these are in Trump's mind. I think that Trump's vision of China incorporates a couple of elements. One, he believes China is a predatory trade power. He thinks China has taken advantage of the US over the decades, and that the US opening with China on trade allowed China to really strip jobs from the US, to woo multinational companies over China who no longer thought about manufacturing in the US, and that Trump is essentially obsessed with this idea of trying to rebalance this trade relationship. I think that he thinks about that a lot. I also think that in many ways, he admires Xi Jinping. He has said that openly. He admires Xi Jinping for several reasons. He thinks that Xi is a strong leader. He admires the way that Xi is able to exercise power, authoritarian power over 1.4 billion people. And I think he looks up to that. I think he also admires the Chinese leaders or the communist leaders, Xi and his predecessors, for taking advantage of those trade openings. Like, he says, if he were in their position, he might have done the same thing, because Trump himself, is a very canny operator of business interests, and of propaganda, and remaking one's image. And I think he feels that the Chinese leadership has been very successful in that, both in terms of their image to within their domestic population, and also to the outside world, and their influence in trade around the world and with the US. So I think that he both admires them, but also sees them as a tough competitor, especially on trade. I don't think he thinks that much about the national security aspects of the relationship. I think other people under him do, and that's true of the first administration as well. But he himself rarely talks about that.
There's certainly some intense debate within the team underneath Trump about the national security portfolio when it comes to U.S.-China relations. We cover that pretty closely in the Threat Status newsletter, whether we're talking about Eldridge Colby or others in the administration and disagreements that go on. You brought up espionage operations, and I can tell this is going to be one of the podcast interviews that we've got to cut short here, because we could go on for an hour easily. But with this issue, do you think the U.S. government and U.S. private companies are aware enough or are doing enough to address and counter Chinese government-backed espionage operations inside the United States right now, whether we're talking about in academia, whether we're talking about influence operations, or corporate and high-tech sector espionage?
Yeah, this is a tough question, because I think that right now there is this very difficult debate going on about benefits versus risks, when you're talking about how to spot potential espionage that's going on, and how to limit it. So, for instance, Secretary of State Rubio came out with a two-line statement a couple of weeks ago that says they're going to start rescinding visas for Chinese nationals who are studying in the U.S. and also working in what he called critical fields. And he didn't define critical fields or talk about, what might set off red flags among students. And then he also said, we'll scrutinize visas of applicants going ahead in the future. And I've talked to people in industries as well as in some national security agencies, and they think that they're wary of there being overreach, because they think that obviously China has immense talent, and they're the main competitor with the U.S. on things like AI or quantum computing, things that will make a huge difference in national security matters in the future. So what you want to do is strike a balance between obviously bringing that talent over here and having them, help the U.S. become the greatest competitor in that arena. But at the same time, be watchful for any people who are being recruited as assets by Chinese state security, for instance, or the PLA. So you're trying to strike that balance, and a lot of people are cautious about overreaching and sort of pushing out people who could benefit the U.S. by having their talent here, and that China could then, of course, pull into their orbit or keep in their orbit much more easily if the US keeps them out. But at the same time, you need to be watchful for recruitment efforts. And I think the US has had a long history, especially during the Cold War, of being able to discern that. And if the national security agencies are trained properly, then they should be able to watch out for that. So that's on the human intelligence level. I think on the, on cyber and SIGINT, that's entirely different story. And I think that China has shown itself to be very capable, obviously, of being a cyber espionage power. And I think that that's even something that the agencies have even greater scrutiny on, more so than the human intelligence in many ways.
Big thoughts here from Ed Wong. Ed is the author of At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China. Ed, thank you for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Guy.
And it's time now for Threats of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically in the U.S., or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you listen to the show. And Guy, my threat of the week is tunnels. Our colleague Stephen Dynan, friend of the show, wrote this week about the Border Patrol uncovering what it called a sophisticated smuggling tunnel stretching more than half a mile between Mexico and the U.S. That tunnel reached more than 1,000 feet and was still under construction when it was discovered in April. It apparently had began inside a residence in Tijuana. This tunnel was wired for electricity, lights, had a ventilation system, a track for moving large quantities of things, potentially drugs or humans, through it. 42 inches high, 28 inches wide. I could go on. To put this in a broader perspective, Customs and Border Protection discovered 40 tunnels from 2017 to 2021 during President Trump's first term, according to data obtained by the Cato Institute Freedom of Information Act request. Back in 2020, authorities said they discovered what was the longest such tunnel ever found, stretched for nearly a mile, also had a lift, a rail track, drainage and air ventilation, and high voltage cables. And it's not just here on the border. Last year, after Israel started its military campaign in Gaza, the Modern War Institute released data showing that the IDF discovered more than 350 and 450 miles of tunnels underneath Gaza, over 1,500 tunnel shafts, individual tunnel shafts. This helped Hamas move weapons, equipment, supplies, and of course, human beings all across the Palestinian enclave without detection. I could go on with more examples, but as we're seeing right now in a different way with Iran's nuclear site at Fordo, some of the most dangerous threats facing the U.S. and its allies are often deep underground.
Interesting, Ben. My threat of the week is that U.S. military installations inside the United States could be targeted by innovative drone attacks by U.S. adversaries. Our own national security correspondent, Bill Gertz, wrote this week that the stunning effectiveness of recent Israeli and Ukrainian attacks deep inside Iran and Russia relied on smuggled and disguised drones and missiles and have raised sharp questions about the vulnerability of U.S. bases, ships, and planes to weapons hidden in harmless-looking shipping containers, which may already be stashed on American soil. That's my threat of the week, Ben, that a surprise attack on the U.S. might not be a major missile attack or doomsday cyber attack, but rather some kind of coordinated drone strike launched from vehicles driving around right in the U.S. homeland.
Yeah, it's amazing how the proliferation of drones, relatively cheap, small drones, is kind of changing the threat landscape all over the world, including here in the U.S. Thanks for that. A huge thanks to Ed Wong from the New York Times for a very fascinating interview. And a big thanks to all of you, of course, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.